The sun had not risen over Green Hollow Valley when Emmett Clark put on his blue uniform for the 36th year in a row. The elbows of the garment were worn, and the badge on the chest had lost its shape from the rain and snow, but Emmett wore it with pride. At 64, he could still walk 15 miles a day without complaining because this was his valley. He knew every road, every mailbox, and every porch where old ladies baked cookies for him. His wife, Margaret, used to say that Emmett did not deliver mail, but brought hope to people. He brought acceptance letters to nervous students, pension checks to grumpy war veterans, and wedding invitations to young couples. When Margaret passed away 5 years ago, everyone in the valley turned out to see him at the funeral. There were more than 300 people at his small church, and every one of them told him how much they appreciated him. After all, in a small town, a mailman was a part of the family. It was a crisp autumn morning, and the sky was as clear as a Vermont summer. Emmett sorted the letters in the small post office, which had stood on Maple Street since 1952. He knew every name on the envelopes. The Wilson family at 47 Oak Lane would be waiting for their son's college transcripts. Old Mrs. Patterson at 12 Pine Road had a card from her sister in Florida. The last address on his route was the largest estate in the valley. It belonged to the Thompson family, who had lived there for 4 generations. However, the Thompsons sold their land last month. They sold everything. Emmett had heard that the new owner was a billionaire from California who had never been on a dirt road in his life. He also heard that the man wanted to buy the entire valley. The billionaire's name was Julian Thorne, and he had bought the land to build a private compound for himself and his billionaire friends. Emmett had heard the rumors, but he did not believe them. It was America, and no one could just buy everything in the valley. There were laws, rules, rights. He clutched the small stack of letters and walked toward the large iron gates that had taken the place of the old wooden fence. The gates were twice as high as Emmett's head, and they opened automatically when he stepped closer. He walked up the gravel road that used to belong to the Thompson family, but everything had changed. The old farmhouse was gone, and in its place, there was a glass and steel mansion. Security cameras followed his every step as he entered the grounds. Emmett felt like a stranger in his own valley. A man in a black suit came out of the front door. He was tall, good-looking, and had sunglasses on his face, despite the cloudy sky. Behind him, Julian Thorne walked out of the house. The billionaire was dressed in a silk shirt that cost more than 30 times Emmett's yearly salary. Thorne looked at Emmett as if he was a bug on his shoe. "You must be the mailman," said Julian. "I've heard about you. The whole valley has. You know, you are a hero of sorts, walking around with your little bag of letters. How quaint." "Good morning, Mr. Thorne. I have some mail for you," said Emmett. The billionaire laughed. "Mail? You think I need mail? I own satellites, Mailman. I can buy this entire valley with the money in my pocket. And you are walking around delivering pieces of paper like it's 1950. Without warning, Julian grabbed the stack of letters from Emmett's hands and threw it on the ground. "This is what I think of your mail," said Julian. "And this is what I think of you." That afternoon, Julian Thorne held a meeting in the community hall. He told every family in the Green Hollow Valley that he had bought the entire estate. He offered to pay them a pittance for their land, but it was barely enough to pay off their mortgages. Every family was silent as the billionaire said that they had 60 days to leave. Emmett stood at the back of the hall, his hands shaking. He thought about Margaret and how she would have wanted him to stand up to Thorne. He thought about his 36 years in the valley, delivering letters to people who had become his friends, family, and neighbors. He thought about the letters that Julian's father had sent to him from the federal prison. The letters had been addressed to his wife, but Emmett had always read them. He knew the name on the envelope. He knew the crimes the man had committed. He knew that Julian was no different from his father, and he knew that he had proof. Emmett did not sleep that night. He sat in his small farmhouse, staring at the worn wooden box on the shelf. He had kept it for more than 30 years, and he still did not know why. Inside the box, he had kept every letter he had delivered to the Thorne family. It was not professional, but Emmett had always had a feeling that one day, the letters would bring him justice. The letters were from Richard Thorne, Julian's father. He had served a 10-year sentence in the federal prison for bank fraud and money laundering. Emmett remembered the envelopes. They were always addressed to Mrs. Thorne and came from the same prison in Pennsylvania. Inside the letters, Richard confessed to his crimes. He wrote to his wife about stealing millions of dollars and laundering the money through shell companies. He wrote about bribing judges and federal officials. He wrote about building his fortune on lies and greed. Richard's son had grown up reading those letters. Julian had known exactly what his father had done. The next morning, Emmett drove to the federal courthouse in Burlington. He carried the wooden box with him like a sacred relic. He asked to speak to an FBI agent, but they tried to dismiss him. Emmett refused to leave and spent 3 hours in the waiting room before an FBI agent agreed to see him. "What do you want, Mr. Clark?" asked Agent Roberts. "The truth," said Emmett. "Everything you need to take down Julian Thorne." His father wrote it all. The shell companies, the bribes, the money laundering. His son is no better than him. In fact, he is worse. Agent Roberts spent the next 2 weeks poring over every letter Emmett had given him. He hired forensic experts to examine the documents and verify their authenticity. He talked to people who had worked for the Thorne family and threatened to press criminal charges for years. In the end, Agent Roberts found enough evidence to convict Julian Thorne for fraud, money laundering, and bribery. The billionaire had committed many crimes, but the most heinous of them all was stealing the land from the families in the Green Hollow Valley. 2 weeks later, federal agents stormed the glass and steel mansion and arrested Julian Thorne in his pajamas. The news spread like wildfire, and the families in the Green Hollow Valley turned out to see Emmett at the post office. They cheered and applauded, but Emmett stood in the back, watching his neighbors and friends celebrate. The courtroom was filled with families from the Green Hollow Valley. They had driven to Burlington to see Julian Thorne brought to justice. The man looked different in the prison uniform. His hair was unkempt, and his face was pale. He did not have the arrogance in his eyes that he was famous for. "The United States of America, vs. Julian Thorne," said Judge Morrison. "The defendant is accused of fraud, money laundering, bribery, and stealing the land from the Green Hollow Valley families. The FBI has presented the court with substantial evidence. Every letter Emmett Clark brought us is proof of the crimes committed by Julian Thorne. The jury has found the defendant guilty on all charges." The judge looked at Julian and said, "Mr. Thorne, you have committed numerous crimes, and this court finds you guilty on all counts. You have exploited the system and stolen the life savings of many innocent Americans. This court sentences you to 15 years in the federal prison. You are ordered to pay all restitution to the families in the Green Hollow Valley. Your assets, including the land in the Green Hollow Valley, are forfeited to the United States of America. The courtroom erupted in applause. Julian looked stunned and tried to protest, but the jailers led him away. The families returned to their homes, and the large iron gates that Julian had put up were dismantled and sold for scrap. The glass mansion stood empty for a while, but the townspeople turned it into a community center. Emmett Clark returned to delivering mail the next day. He was 64, but he felt young. The people he served greeted him with fresh cookies and warm hugs. They called him a hero, but Emmett always reminded them that he was just a mailman. One afternoon, the townspeople held a ceremony in his honor. They gave him a plaque that said, "To Emmett Clark, who delivered more than mail. He delivered justice." Emmett stood at the podium and looked at the faces of his neighbors and friends. He thought about Margaret and smiled. In America, he said, the loudest voice is not always the strongest. Sometimes the quietest person in the room knows the most. Sometimes a simple mailman can bring down a billionaire. After all, when you live with integrity, when you remember the truth, you have a power that money can never buy. I am proud to be your mailman. I am proud to be an American. And I am proud to call this valley my home. The crowd gave him a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes. And as the sun set over the green hollow valley, Emmett Clark walked home the same dirt road he had walked 36 years earlier. But this time, he walked with his head held high. The end.